Welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. It's the 4 o'clock block. It's transitional justice time on a given Monday. And with us today from the Project Expedite Justice organization is Mutasim Ali. He joins us by Zoom from Virginia this time. Hi, Mutasim. Nice to see your smiling face.
Hi, thank you, Jay, for having me again, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, I want to just talk about a little about you. You're with Project Expedite Justice. And you went to school in Sudan. I guess you're from Sudan also. But tell us about your educational process and what you took out of it.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, again for this opportunity. I really appreciate this. I think, often this platform to voice the concerns of the, victims of atrocities and crimes. I think this is really important, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Speaking of my educational background, it began from Yes, from Sudan, but also from Sudan, from western part of Sudan, Darfur, the region Darfur, which we'll talk about in a bit. It hasn't been an easy period of time because most of the time I stayed away from my family, and that's primarily because my parents would send me away for better schools. And I did my first degree in geology, and then I had to leave the country seeking asylum because of what is happening in Darfur until today, in fact. And I moved to Israel, where I spent the last 11 years. That's where I did a new degree in law. I changed totally the subject from geology to law, right? And then I moved to America to do my master's in international and comparative law. And the reason why I did that shift from geology to law school is because of the atrocities atrocities that are still taking place in Darfur. My family is actually still in displaced persons camp, just like many Darfuris and other Sudanese were forced to leave their homes, and that's because of systematic attacks by the Sudanese government. This is not only one regime, but subsequent Sudanese regimes that abused the resources, abused the state's resources to promote exclusive identities, and that's part of the reason why Darfur is still in conflict. And we had South Sudan before it became an independent state. We have other regions like South Kordofan and eastern part of Sudan, and so this is one of the reasons why I shifted to law so that I can help, be the voice for those who are still in the IDP camps, but also to promote justice and peace.
What have you done actually, along that line, in that mission?
Honestly speaking, I do not feel I've done much, right, in terms of, because there is much needed to be done, and it really requires a lot of efforts and many people to help, because the damage that is caused by the Sudanese regimes um, are so immense, right? Like, and it was a lot of efforts, but I involved in a lot of activism with community organizations, but also as advocate, right? Being here working with Project Expedite Justice, involved in many programs, including training attorneys, mentoring lawyers who are litigating cases in Sudan, and the idea of doing this is primarily to empower local attorneys to help the victims of atrocities and human rights violations. And we are continuing to do a lot of work, and I really feel like I'm not doing much, but my heart is there, and I'm still continuing to do much.
I know that.
To do more. Yeah,
I know that. Let's take another look at the map of Sudan, and maybe you can help us understand the topography, the geography, the neighbors around Sudan, and the parts of Sudan that are particularly problematic.
right. And so what we have in the map there is like the the old Sudan, right? Sudan before it became an before South Sudan got its independence in 2011. And so in that map, in the western part of Sudan, there is a region called Darfur. This is where I came from, where atrocities are taking place. And now it's not in the same scale as a couple of years ago because we have a new regime in place. We can speak briefly about that in a bit. But Darfur is one of the regions in that largest Sudan that is going through crimes. And in the southern part of Sudan, there is like South Sudan. Now it became an independent state. But a little upper South Sudan, there is like a region called South Kordofan or Nuba Mountains. Like it's the same, either South Kordofan or Nuba Mountains, the same. Then we have Blue Nile, and the eastern part we have Eastern Sudan. All of these are regions that are going through human rights violations and atrocities, crimes against humanity and all of that. And so this is where we focus a lot of our efforts. And if we ask ourselves question, why these regions in particular, right? Like
Yes, big question.
Right. So it is really, this is one of the things that the government of, the governments of Sudan, as I said earlier, abused the resources of the state. And the idea was primarily to promote exclusive identities, right? To promote.
What does that mean, Mutasim? What does that mean?
Right.
Exclusive identities.
Right. So the idea was to promote an Arab Islamic identity. While we have many African groups, many non-believers in Islam, we have Christians, we have different faiths, and so the government intended to change the identity of the Sudanese people of these regions because these regions are mostly African indigenous groups, and so the armed paramilitary groups to prosecute and commit atrocities against populations of these regions. And that's why we see most of the atrocities that are committed in these areas. And many of the people of these areas are either displaced or became refugees.
They're running away from the atrocities, running away from the government. And when they get displaced, they wind up in displacement camps that are outside of Sudan?
So we have internally displaced persons, like for instance, in Darfur, we have over 2.5 million people displaced within Darfur. And then we have refugees as well in neighboring countries like Chad, like Cameroon, like in Uganda and Kenya and all of this. And so we have refugees all over the place. And that's the same as well for the region of South Kordofan. There are internally displaced persons, but also there are refugees. And so basically people were just fleeing to seek safety and place where they could really, not necessarily having decent life because there's no decent life in a war zone, but at least fleeing.
They're not free. Their movements are not free. If they're in the camps, either inside of Sudan or outside, they can't leave. It's like being in jail, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I can tell you that many of the internally displaced persons in Darfur, because I speak a lot about Darfur because I'm from there, and so I'm more knowledgeable about the situation there. There are many people in isolated areas, right? Like in caves, in top of mountains. And so not even there is no access to them, not even by humanitarian aid organizations. And so the humanitarian situation is very dire, and the atrocities are still going on because paramilitary militias are still committing the same atrocities.
Well, can I ask you atrocities? What do you mean by that? I almost hate to hear the answer, but why don't you tell people what atrocities means in this context?
Yeah, when we say atrocities, we refer to crimes like war crimes, crimes like committed during armed conflict, or crimes against humanity when the target is, innocent civilians, right? or genocide or grave human rights violations. These are the atrocities that we're referring to. They're also called international crimes, right? In the context of Sudan, these crimes are mostly committed by or aided by the Sudanese government. And so you can see that people really do not have any trust in government, and they fear government because the government is sort of an enemy to the civilians in the regions like Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. These, again, I repeat, these regions for the audience to be familiar with because these are the regions going through atrocities and crimes.
So
International
is
crimes.
Sudan more, does it have more atrocities than other places, for example, in Africa or elsewhere in the world? Is it a special center of atrocities?
It is hard to answer yes or no because unfortunately there are many countries in Africa that are going through serious international crimes. I'm saying this because I know, for instance, in Rwanda in the early 90s there was a genocide, right? In Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Central African Republic, and there are many other places that are going through serious crimes. Darfur is no exception, I have to say, not only in Africa, but also other parts of the world. But again, Darfur is one of the regions that is still that many crimes are still, sponsored by the government, right? Like even though now we have a new transitional government, but that really didn't stop crimes from continuing. So the crimes continue to occur in the region of Darfur as well as other regions within Sudan. So
I have
Darfur is
trouble
really not an exception.
understanding why anybody in the government would want to commit atrocities against his or her own people. Is it they want people to change their ethnicity, their culture, their religion? Is that what this is about? Why do they attack their own people? Why do they, make the country non-functional or dysfunctional and violent and dangerous? Why would they do that?
Definitely, there is no an answer to that, right? Because whatever the reason is, that no reason can justify, committing atrocities and genocide against, civilians, against your own people, right?
Well, it sounds
So
like madness. It sounds like
it's
madness.
just it's just madness, but also people are just brutal, and it is unfortunate. This and actually, this is not the first time to happen, right? Like it happened during the Nazi regime in Germany, right? And back then, people said never again, but we continue to see these events over and over again. And I really hope that never again should be not just a slogan, but actually something that in practice that never again. I don't want to see the experience that we are going through in Darfur to happen again
Mm.
in any other part of the world. And that's part of the reason why I think it is important to speak about transitional justice and accountability to ensure that these crimes will not be committed again.
So what's the direction on this? What is the dynamic? Is it getting better or worse or the same? Are international organizations concerned with atrocities having an effect on the atrocities that are being committed? I don't. It didn't sound from what you said that there was a notable improvement. Which direction is it going?
Unfortunately, as I said, there is much needed to be done because the damage is so big. And in Darfur, in the early 2000, like in the 2003, 4, and 5, there was a lot of international intervention to stop the atrocities and to stop the crimes. And there was a lot of pressure on the Sudanese government to stop arming the paramilitary, to stop aiding in the crimes in Darfur. Now that we have a new transitional government after ousting the former brutal regime, the international community sort of began to lift a little bit of a pressure from the government, hoping that things will change. But unfortunately, crimes are still happening in Darfur, right? And the civilians in Darfur are still being attacked on a daily basis. These attacks are repeated time and again. And one of the reasons is that the paramilitary militias that were armed by the former regime are still in the country now, right? And actually, one of the militia commanders is like the holding highest office in the country today. And so it is no surprise to see these atrocities from happening time and again.
Mhm.
And so the international community is like really treating the situation in Darfur today in Sudan a little careful now because we have transitional government. They want this transitional government to succeed on one hand, but on the other, um, the threats are still there, right? Civilians are being attacked on a daily basis, and so really there's sort of a messy situation right there.
Is the transitional government, does the transitional government want to stop these attacks? Does it want to stop the atrocities and is unable to do so? Or does it not want to stop the attacks and the atrocities at all?
We have a very complex transitional government. The transitional government is a compromise between military leaders and civilian leaders, civilians who were the leaders of the protests that led to the ousting of the former regime, right? And so we have military leaders who are, some of them were involved in the crimes that were committed in Darfur and other regions of Sudan. And then we have civilian leaders. Now they share power. And so even if the civilian leaders would like to transition into democracy, you have that military part of the government that makes it difficult, if at all, to transition. Because in the end, to transition into democracy, you would have to through that process of, investigation and prosecutions and account. And so this is the dilemma that Sudanese people are in right now. And so maybe there is like a will from the civilian part of the government, but then we have the military part who are allegedly involved in the crimes. They're making it really difficult to transition.
Well, suppose I'm an ordinary person and I wish to protest as others have in the past, and I get out on the street and I protest against something the government is doing or not doing. Am I at risk for speaking my mind?
Yes, because even though they, the there's like a little bit of a freedom right now, again, because of this new status of having a transitional government, but it's still the people are being arrested, right, for speaking their free minds. There are many examples of not necessarily journalists, but ordinary people are, being arrested. And so this is one of the things, but let alone the freedom of speech. Think about this. People are still in the internally displaced persons camp despite this despite this transitional government. People are still in a refugee camp despite the change that we have in Sudan right now. This only shows that we are far from moving into democracy because we are yet to deal with the core issues that led to why people are forced to displace in the first place.
Yeah. So it's not a complete solution at all. And I wonder, what this sounds very hard to solve this problem because you have to allow the transitional government to remain in power because they are the only practical way to get to a better place. But they themselves are really not doing all that good a job. And there's a dark side to that transitional government that you cannot control. So the question is, what can you do about that? We're talking about accountability. We're talking about truth commissions. We're talking about investigation, prosecution of those that you find responsible for atrocities and crimes against humanity. This is not easy because you have to identify the individuals, and the individuals are largely in the existing government. Am I right?
Right. And so I totally agree with you. This is an extremely difficult, situation to deal with. On one hand, would like to have this transitional government succeed, but on the other, want to make sure that we don't want to hear more about these crimes, right? Like, we would like to have innocent civilians to feel peace and safe, and to return to their homes. But I think. Uh, if we're speaking of ending impunity, we have to ending the atrocity. We have to end impunity, right? Um, there is, one of the things I think we need to focus on a lot is non-repetition of crimes, and to do this non-repetition of crimes, we have to hold perpetrators accountable, even if they are in the government. Otherwise, we do not call this a change, right? Like, if we have somehow a change and crimes are still happening and we're unable to hold the perpetrators accountable, then how can we refer to this as a change, right? And so the solution would be for the international community to continue to place the pressure on the government to hold the perpetrators accountable, because this is not only in the interest of the people of Darfur, but in the interest of the international community as a whole, right? Because in the end, if these atrocities continue to happen, definitely we will see it again somewhere else and won't be able to do anything about it. And so the international community has to do much and to be more aggressive with the regime, or the elements of the regime that um, facilitate or allow for these crimes to continue.
So in a way, Darfur and Sudan are examples for the world to see. What I mean is, if there are atrocities happening and the international community is able to slow that down, to do accountability in Sudan, then maybe other countries in which it is happening, maybe in other degrees, maybe more or less, what have you, will take note. And the mechanism by which the international community has succeeded in that will be seen beyond the borders of Sudan, which would be a very valuable experience for all the world to see, maybe have an effect globally, maybe, hopefully, one day. So,
Right.
who is the international community, Mutasim? Who are they? Do they speak through the United Nations, the International Court of Criminal Justice? Who do they speak through?
The international community primarily would be the United Nations with its different organs. The international organizations that they are very powerful in terms of advocacy and lobbying for the victims and all of that. The international community or countries were concerned about these crimes, because these crimes are international crimes. These are not only um, Sudanese crimes, right? Because in the end, when we speak of crimes such as genocide, this does not only, again, affect the Sudanese and the Darfuri people alone, but it affect everybody. These are crimes of international concerns, right? Because it destabilizes the international peace and security. And
Yes,
so, for that reason, all the countries have the obligation to act to prevent these crimes.
but
And
this is out of George Orwell, 1984, or is it Animal Farm? And one of those books where he said, "Hmm, all animals are created equal, except some animals are more equal than others." And what I
unfortunately,
mean by that is that some members of the international community will help, but others will help more or less, not all the same. So,
right.
could you identify some countries in the international community that are particularly, committed to do what they can to stop crimes against humanity?
It will be hard to identify specific countries who are more committed to to stop these atrocities, right? But I know there are many countries that work within the United Nations framework to stop these atrocities. However, there is also international, um, not international, but more of countries have interest in internal conflicts of other countries, right? And we see that a lot in many places, like in Syria or even in Sudan or in Iraq and all of that. But at the end of the day, um, there is no country that will benefit um, from genocide that is committed against innocent civilians, and so it is the interest of everybody to involve. But I think with that in mind, there are countries that have the means to act faster and use the resources, right, to stop these atrocities.
But what could they do? What could they do to participate in that process? What steps could they, what is in their bag of inventory? What are the tools and levers that they could pull, to stop genocide, to stop atrocities?
Right. I'll give you an example of the United States, for instance, right? United States, like the most powerful country in the world, and it has a lot of resources and many means to stop atrocities from happening. One thing can do, I'm not speaking of intervention, right? Like I kind of speak of imposing sanctions on perpetrators, sanctions on regimes, and working with allies, right, such as members of the United Nations Security Council, right, to do more to stop atrocity. And there are some means that can be really effective in terms of because in the end, the reason why perpetrators or militias are continuing to commit these atrocities is because they have money, they have resources. And so one of the ways is to impose sanctions on them to make sure they do not have the means to continue to commit atrocities. This is number one thing. Of course, there are many other means, and I'm sure there are, many models that can be used to make sure that these atrocities would not continue.
Well, I'm thinking of the corporate world, particularly the global corporate world. We saw in Georgia not too long ago where Georgia passed an anti-voting rights bill, and to their eternal discredit. And some of the corporations that did business in Georgia, you saw that, stepped up, and they said, that we disapprove of that. Not that they were early enough; they were a little late, because the bill got passed before they complained about it. But other states may find that the corporate world would oppose them when they try to do things that are inhumane or immoral like that. And so the same, I think, on an international level. What about global international corporations? Do they step up? Are they part of this? I'm thinking in terms of the Banco Nacional de Paris, where I think they were lending money to the government of Sudan, which effectively enabled the government of Sudan to do atrocities. And so there was and is a lawsuit in France against BNP. That's certainly something that Project Expedite Justice can assist in. Is that the kind of thing that is useful with the global community? The global corporate community can either take affirmative steps or at least be restrained from taking negative ones.
Absolutely. So this is the kind of things that can be. I mean, again, the global corporate community, of course, like recently, companies began to adopt, corporate social responsibilities and protecting human rights and all of that. But it's still, there are corporates that are still assisting governments or paramilitia groups to commit atrocities, like the case that we have at hand, like the BNP Bank in France, right? This is the case that the PEJ is litigating. And I think this is the other effective way to stop these kind of atrocities or to limit the space for the corporates, assisting the governments such as the Sudanese government to commit atrocities. This is a litigation led by by organizations such as Project Expedite Justice, right? if we combine this with efforts or sanctions imposed by the government, by the United States government, or other sanctions by UK or France, and all of these efforts will together work to eliminate the crimes such as those are committed in Darfur.
So what can be done? I'm thinking of our discussion before the show began about how democracy seems to be in trouble these days. What can be done to create, reinstate, encourage the transition of the government of South Sudan into a more democratic, moral, ethical, responsible, accountable government? I mean, that's the fundamental problem. And how do you do that? I mean, like, for example, would anybody like you go back to Sudan and knit up an organization that would be vocal about this and run for office to the extent you can do that and try to change the way the country is run? I mean, it's fundamental constitutional process. Is that possible? Can that ever happen? You think it will happen?
Yes. So here we're speaking of the Sudan, like the northern part of Sudan, not the South Sudan, right? And of course, one way to make or to promote change in countries like Sudan, yes, to have people who are committed to human rights to go back and serve in public office, but that's like sort of a longer term policy, longer term plan. But at the moment, where we are here and we have a transitional government and we aspire for a democratic government and peace and stability, what can we do? Right? Everybody in Sudan today speaks about transitional justice, right? This is, yes, an important mechanism. And as we spoke last time with the help of your device, Alexa, we define transitional justice like an array of several mechanisms, like, right, of justice mechanisms to help us confront the atrocities of the past and move into a prosperous future. And one thing, and in Sudan today, we speak about transitional justice, but more, we do not focus on the key components of the transitional justice. We are not speaking of thorough investigations and accountability, right? We focus a lot in Sudan, I'm speaking, on peace, on reconciliation. And it's really hard to do reconciliation and peace without accountability. And so, unfortunately, and as I said again, the reason why we continue to see horrible, events that are happening in Darfur is because of the impunity, right? Perpetrators feel that they are free, and so what we need to do is to hold the perpetrators accountable. This is number one thing, right? To make sure that these crimes will not go without, people, the perpetrators being held accountable. This is number one thing. And number two, we need to, to adopt measures that are victim-centered measures, right? That the victims are the center of these measures to make sure that they are satisfied, right, with the transition. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to have a transitional justice that is vertical from the elites, from up down, right? We would like to have transitional justice that is victim-centered to make sure that these victims are satisfied with the accountability mechanisms, with the investigation, with truth-setting committees and all of that. And that's the way we can move forward. And this is doable if there is a political will.
What strikes me from what you say, there are two things that are essential to the process. Number one is truth. I think a lot of authoritarian governments, military juntas, what have you, it's all about denying the reality. It's about denying what the claim is, denying that they did anything bad. And if they deny it and nobody is able to show otherwise, then that becomes the reality. So a truth commission an investigation is really critical to the process you describe. We must know for sure, because the default position of people who engage in atrocities is to deny that they engaged in atrocities. We must overcome that. The other thing that I take from what you say is that the people who we care about and who have been the victims of atrocity have to be brought back into the country, into the government, into the polity, the country, and they have to be made responsible citizens again. And part of that is they have to have confidence in not only that they've been, recognized and treated better, but they have to have confidence in the government, because you cannot knit it all back together again into a democracy unless they believe in it. So there are many steps involved in that. And as you know, in this country, it's hard for people to have confidence in the government when the government is doing all these bizarre things under the Trump administration. And so I'm sure that's the case elsewhere too, that you want to show them that it's worthwhile to be there and that they have a future there and that they can participate and have confidence. And only then can you build a resilient, sustainable democracy.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, no solution can be without having the affected communities being consulted with, right? This is an important in any democratic transition, in any society, post-conflict society. And that's part of reason why when we speak about the, transitional justice, we focus a lot about addressing the grievances of the victims by offering a platform for them to speak about their pain, right? And here we spoke about a very important thing about trust in the government. Like right now in Darfur, people really do not trust the government, because the government over the years, I'm not speaking of the last 30 years, I'm speaking of since the independence of Sudan in 1956, the government is always the enemy of the people. This is how people in Darfur view the government. People in South Kordofan view the government, or other regions of Sudan, right? Like they view the government as an enemy. And so we have to build that trust. But we can't build that trust so long as we have a transitional government, but is unable to hold the perpetrators accountable. These perpetrators, most of the time, they use the government or the military uniform, right? And so, in the eyes of the affected communities and the victims, this is the government. And even if this is not the government, this is within Sudan, and it is in the government's capability to prevent this. The government is there. The government is supposed to be there to protect the civilians. But if the government is, standing idly by while crimes are being committed, then what will we infer? We infer that the government is yes aiding these paramilitia groups. And so, for that reason, we need to restore confidence in the government and their institutions, right? And we do that only by communicating with the affected communities, listening to their concerns, and hold the perpetrators accountable. That's the key to move into democratic transition.
And we have miles to go before we sleep. We have miles to go before we can rest about this. Thank you so much, Mutasim Ali. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And Mutasim, I'd like to do this again. I'd like to pursue all the issues and the events as they unfold, because as you said, they're still unfolding. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Jay.
Aloha.
Thank you for the opportunity. Take care. Bye-bye.